Speaker tonight. Hi, I'm Nicole
Hi,
Judy
Nicole.
Rhodes. Hi, Lori. Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Um, and I can't see everyone else, but thank you so much for being here. I'm the Director of Audience Engagement at the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, and we are so excited to tonight learn about the movement and the principles that inspired the creation of Philadelphia's only public landscape designed by the Olmsted firm of landscape architects, and to understand the historical and the architectural underpinnings of this space as many of us prepare to visit it for the upcoming 2021 Philadelphia Flower Show, and also in advance of the upcoming Olmsted 200 Bicentennial, of which Laurie is the honorary chair, I believe.
It's something like
So
that, yeah.
there's a lot of intersections, as we would say, with this landscape right now. And I feel like we will all have a better appreciation for it very shortly. So we have many people here from outside the region. Welcome to all of you. For anyone who is new to PHS, I want to let you know that besides doing programs like these, which we've had the opportunity to do quite a bit in the last year, we use gardening and greening as a tool for community development. And that means everything from investing in community gardens to increasing the number of trees planted in on streets throughout the region, transforming abandoned vacant land, and providing better resources for people who want to sort of pick up the mantle of gardening and run with it. In this webinar, audio and the video of the audience is turned off, but you can submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you experience technical issues, put those in the chat, and Sarah, that some of you just saw and met, she can help you with that. So Q&A for questions that I'll give to Laurie at the end, chat for tech. So I'm so grateful to our speaker, Laurie Olin of Olin Partnership, for being with us tonight. Laurie is a distinguished teacher, author, one of the most renowned landscape architects practicing today. From vision to realization, he's guided many of Olin's signature projects, spanning the history of the studio from Washington Monuments grounds in Washington, D.C. to Bryant Park in New York City. His recent projects include the AIA award-winning Barnes Foundation, right here in Philadelphia, and the Simon and Helen Director Park in Portland, Oregon. He's currently practice professor of landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's taught for 40 years, and is the former chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at Harvard University. He is the recipient of many national and international awards and honors. And as Philadelphia, we really have such good fortune of being able to engage in and enjoy so many of his landscapes throughout the course of our days. So thank you for that as well, Laurie.
You're welcome.
Again, thanks you to everybody. And Laurie, begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, I'm delighted. Thank you, Nicole, for the lovely introduction. Very generous. Today, we're going to talk about Olmsted Firm and FDR Park, but I want to also talk about what the legacy of Olmsted is as well, and then the nature of this park. So when we talk about the Olmsteds, we're actually talking about several people and work that occurred over a period of 100 years, and it was led by these four men, really, but with the assistance of an army of others, of partners, associates, consultants, collaborators, contractors, clients, both in public and private. Now, from the left, we see Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. at the age he was when he began Central Park prior to the Civil War. And then next to him, to his left, it would be, and the second one from the left is Calvert Vaux, who was a design partner for 20 years from 1858 to 1878. And then next to him are the two sons, his adopted son, John Charles Olmsted, and then the younger son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., also called Rick. Now, this is a group that practiced basically in total from about 1858 to 1950, which is absolutely astonishing. To appreciate the achievement of Olmsted, one must first try to imagine his world, that of the major cities of the East Coast at the time. As the opening line of the great novel, The Go-Between, says so brilliantly, the past is another country. They do things differently there. America was a dynamic and turbulent country in the 19th century. Cities and the economy were expanding rapidly. Immigrants were pouring in from Europe and Asia. Industry was burgeoning, and work was difficult. It was long. It was dangerous. Cities were crowded, dirty, often unhealthy, and they were racked with social inequity and conflict. Here's an image of New York as it appeared in about 1850, when Olmsted, who'd grown up in Hartford, Connecticut, and had spent his youth in the rural Connecticut, New England, began a farm on Staten Island. Within a decade, however, by age 36, he'd begun the construction of what may be to this day still the greatest work of American art, Central Park, to be followed only a few years later with its grand equal and nearly opposite sibling, Prospect Park in Brooklyn. These vast radical works of landscape construction changed their respective cities and launched a new profession of landscape architecture in America. How was it that this singular individual was capable of such triumphs of imagination and logistical and managerial expertise, these 19th century evocations of Rus and Urbs? Well, the answer is that few individuals could have been so well prepared intellectually or practically. Olmsted had a remarkable career prior to taking on the management of the first construction work at Central Park, and then with Calvert Vaux producing its final design and realization. Following a youthful study and travel as a seaman to Asia, for a time, Olmsted was a journalist, a writer, he was a correspondent, an editor, and a publisher. This gallery of faces you see here presents only a few of his contemporaries, but it offers some sense of the heady mix of intellectuals and personalities with whom he corresponded, who he met, published, worked, and socialized with. From the upper left, you see Ralph Waldo Emerson. Then, of course, there's Abraham Lincoln, Walt Whitman, Frederick Douglass, H.H. Richardson, the architect. Then in the middle row, we've got contemporaries Karl Marx, Frederick Ingalls, Thomas Carlyle, the philosopher in Scotland, Charles Darwin. And in the bottom row, of course, Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Horace Greeley, Margaret Fuller, Charles Dickens, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Olmsted was involved in Putnam's Monthly, The Nation, the New York Daily Times, and a publication called Garden and Forest, and books on his travels he wrote about England and the antebellum American South, as well as being a correspondent with Andrew Jackson Downing when Vaux was working with him prior to Downing's death. Olmsted was uniquely prepared to tackle social issues and urban improvement through physical design. It's a commonplace to remark that his parks are derived from 18th century English landscape parks, such as these two designed by Capability Brown, Lancelot Capability Brown. Blenheim Park near Oxford is shown on the left, and Longleat in southwest Salisbury near Wiltshire is on the right. And here, these are characterized by vast swaths of meadow and pasture with livestock, sheep and cattle, undulating water bodies and lakes, great clumps of trees and surrounding forest plantations with curving drives and paths along which the occasional eye-catching pavilions in the distance and very modest architectural features generally off in the parks. Such parks have a very ancient pedigree. Their design was heavily inspired by literary and poetic writings dating to classical times in Greece and Rome, particularly the writings of Virgil, of Horace, Ovid, and Pliny that praised agrarian and pastoral activity and scenery, contrasting it to the difficulties and complexities of urban life. Such imagery and rhetoric was revived in the Renaissance Italy, and it became the basis for a considerable body of theatrical, literary, and visual art, as well as the construction of country villas, parks, and gardens. These are two 17th century paintings that were made in Rome for avid collectors and visitors by Claude Lorrain, and they present this bucolic imagery. Well, when he was 22, Olmsted took a trip to England and to the continent, visiting many of these parks. Years later, he published Walks and Talks, only 2 years later, he published Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. One of the places that he was most impressed by was the recently completed Birkenhead Park in Liverpool, which you see here. It was designed by Joseph Paxton, a brilliant engineer and inventor who had also been the head gardener for the Duke of Devonshire. Birkenhead was a purpose-built public park built by the city and a group of industrialists and merchants for the public use and enjoyment, and for the urban workers and middle-class townspeople. It was very much, as you see, in the form of the pastoral country parks created in the previous century for the exclusive use of upper-class gentry and landowners. Well, as he went about reading, exploring, writing, and inventing himself, Olmsted developed a profound social and civic vision with an obligation to public service. So in 1858, working closely with a talented partner, the gifted English architect Calvert Vaux, he developed this award-winning scheme for the design of a new major public park in the middle of the island of Manhattan in New York. And that's the famous greensward plan you see there that they produced. Surprisingly and quickly, he developed logistical and technical methods for landscape and infrastructure construction at a very large scale, marshaling men and materials to undertake the movement of massive amounts of excavation, soils, and plants and building supplies. Here you can see the construction of the site of the lake just south of the Ramble in Central Park. The construction, however, was stopped suddenly in 1861 when the Civil War broke out. Unable to serve in the military due to a childhood injury, Olmsted became the head of the United States Sanitary Commission, moving his family to Washington, D.C., where he worked tirelessly, day and night, setting up hospitals and arranging for the production and distribution of medical supplies, transportation of the Union wounded, finding people to work there. He worked himself into a complete state. The Sanitary Commission, which he was directing, was, of course, the forerunner of the American Red Cross. Well, in a state of complete nervous exhaustion, basically what we would call a breakdown, he fled and escaped this carnage and exhaustion of the East in the Civil War by accepting an offer to move to Northern California to manage the Comstock Mariposa Mining Company's facilities and set up their camps and their systems and their transportation, their logistics in the Sierra Nevada near Yosemite. And he would live there and work there from 1863 to 1865. Another one of those life-changing events. This led to his producing the Yosemite and Mariposa Grove Preliminary Report of 1865 that described their features and their importance, along with a detailed management strategy that, although controversial, was largely implemented, and they both became park preserves. Well, as the war was ending and the mining company was in the throes of going bankrupt, Olmsted received an invitation from Vaux to return to New York. The commissioners of the independent city of Brooklyn wanted to engage them to design a park to rival the one they'd begun across the river and were continuing to develop in Manhattan. Prospect Park was to become a grand park and a vast response to the, as you see, in this long picture, the long meadow here. And it also contained this forest and big bodies of water, similar to what he'd done in Central Park, only they're much less constrained, as you see in that plan on the left. These parks were physical expressions of Olmsted's strong views about civilizing American cities and making them more livable, especially regarding health and the benefits of nature, of fresh air, and of democracy and individual freedom. He was interested in the mixing of social classes in a shared and safe space. Wealthy families could promenade in their carriages, workers could stroll about and sit in a picnic, and the diverse populace could enjoy leisure, recreation, and take the pleasure of their companions while they were in open expanses of greensward amid vast plantations of shrubs, flowers, and sheltering woodland. There were bodies of water that provided stimulus and recreation, habitat, and cooling the air, along with modest pavilions, shelters, bridges, miles of paths, bridle trails, and carriage drives, overlooks, even concert groves. In a sequence of projects, Olmsted and Vaux exploited natural features and terrain that would prove difficult and expensive for the construction of buildings and streets, but which could be transformed into natural seeming landscapes of high quality, all for public use. These photographs, taken about 60 years apart, the top and the bottom there, these pairs show the continuous use and the really remarkable success, the social utility of these parks that they were designing. They were created at this vast scale and with a palette that survived and has served citizens in New York City now, let's see, for 100 years before requiring the rescue and rehabilitation by the Central Park Conservancy, which began in the late 1960s and continues today. These elements and this particular vision became a hallmark of the work of the firm, Olmsted and Vaux, later the Olmsted brothers. These are two views of Cherokee Park and its boulevard, which they created in Louisville, Kentucky, one of many projects they began to build around the country. Work poured in, and by 1868, only 10 years after starting Central Park and 3 after the end of the Civil War, they developed a plan for a park system for Buffalo, New York. It was innovative. It was the first integrated park and parkway system overlaid upon an existing urban structure in the country, and it gave shape to the future development of the city of Buffalo. Here is Olmsted and Vaux's plan for Riverside, done the very next year in 1869. It was one of the very first suburban developments in America. Particular elements that were central to their earlier park vision are also employed here, as you'll notice. Instead of straight streets and rectangular blocks of urban communities, as in New York, Philadelphia, or Chicago, these streets curve instead, and they disappear in ranks of trees. A small river and a floodplain have been transformed into a sequence of natural-seeming ponds and meadows of woodland. There are boulevards with trees and greensward. The photograph I took about 1990, you can see how it had matured. Well, in 1871, just a few years later, Olmsted and Vaux produced the initial design for Jackson and Washington parks in Chicago. These contained a series of lagoons and islands that were connected by a plaisance with canals that were reminiscent of something that Olmsted had noticed when he took a trip through the jungles in the Isthmus of Panama a few years earlier. And he had written that the trip through Panama was his inspiration for this heavily planted, watery set of parks that he envisioned for a particularly marshy site on the south side of Chicago along Lake Michigan. Its development, however, was halted 2 years later by the Great Chicago Fire. Well, as their fame spread and their connections to powerfully placed individuals in industry, commerce, and government, this led to them being commissioned to redesign and improve the setting for the US Capitol in Washington, D.C., which they were to work on, at least Olmsted was, and his firm, for the next 18 years. This is the rendered presentation plan they offered to the United States Capitol grounds, which is rich in its architectural furnishing, if you've seen it. The details there are quite wonderful, and some of them, for instance, there's this little sketch you see on the right. It's a pencil sketch of a refreshment grotto for hot and weary visitors, which is fairly common in Washington, D.C. in the summer, that it remains on the north of the grounds, just to the north of the Capitol. But it's one of the very few small drawings that we have that are attributed to Olmsted's hand himself. Well, in 1879, the year after their partnership split up and Fred moved to Boston, the mayor of Buffalo and the state of New York asked Calvert Vaux if he would come and help develop a park at the American Falls in Niagara. Vaux, in turn, invited Olmsted once more to join him, and together they developed the Niagara Reservation to preserve it from development and maintain it as a scenic source. The great landscapes and scenery of America was something that Olmsted felt very strongly about preserving, not just bringing nature into cities. Well, in 1882, before the first presidential term of Abraham Lincoln, Congress had also passed the Morrill Act, authorizing the development of colleges in the states and territories of the West to assist in teaching and educating sufficient talent to build and manage the towns that were developing, their infrastructure, and the agriculture of an expanding nation. So between 1865 and 1900, the Olmsted firm produced plans and designs for 36 campuses, including Amherst, Trinity, then in the 1890s, Northwestern, Columbia, Bryn Mawr, Dartmouth, Cornell, Princeton, Smith, Harvard, Mount Holyoke, and Vassar, among others. Between 1900 and 1915, in the outbreak of World War I, they were employed by Brown, the University of Chicago, Wheaton College, Wellesley, Williams, University of Washington, Johns Hopkins, Ohio State, the University of Colorado, University of Pennsylvania, NYU, Oberlin, Swarthmore, Annapolis, West Point, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Oregon, Oregon State. The list rolls on. Between 1900 and 1960, the Olmsted firm worked on more than 180 campuses. Well, as the work poured in, they needed help, and talented young men joined the firm, such as Henry Codman and Charles Eliot, the nephew of the president of Harvard University. Eliot was responsible for the Boston Regional Park System, later referred to as the Emerald Necklace. And Olmsted's elder son, John Charles, had also entered the firm by then, and he was taking on more responsibility. The Columbian Exposition in Chicago of 1893, in part inspired by the 1889 World's Exposition in Paris, was planned and designed by a very large team of architects, engineers, and boosters from Chicago, as well as the Olmsted firm. Largely, it was a Beaux-Arts vision of Daniel Burnham and Charles Fulton McKim, and it set in motion the City Beautiful movement in American civic planning and design, as exemplified by the Benjamin Franklin Parkway and its monumental cultural buildings here in Philadelphia. Well, here is the Lagoon, and with its wooded islands and pavilions that Olmsted and his crew produced. And on the right, you see an island with a Japanese tea house that had a profound influence on Frank Lloyd Wright and others. This park was astonishing to people. You note the panoply of mature trees and the large shrubs that the Olmsteds had rounded up, shipped to the site, and managed to get planted along with the construction of the lagoon, walks, and terraces for the crowds within 2 years. An astonishing logistical enterprise. By the time Olmsted moved to Boston in 1879, he was being invited to prepare designs for private estates as well as municipal parks and preserves. The largest and most ambitious of these private estates was that of the Biltmore estate in Asheville, North Carolina, which he worked on, which was developed between 1889 and 1895. His adopted son, John Charles, who you see here working in the office, along with a group of talented young men, were tending to projects all across the country. And a natural designer, JC, as he's called by some of us, many of his drawings were, even for a time, misidentified as those of H.H. Richardson. This is the Olmsted family on the upper left, most of them. And what you see here is Fred, he's wearing a pith helmet. His wife is in the checkered dress, and young Frederick Law Olmsted, other junior, known as Rick, is in the foreground with his sister and aunts. The letter you see below that is one that, with his notes and sketches, was sent when he sent from the site at Biltmore, where he spent part of his apprenticeship on the construction site, learning to build things in the field, after he had already spent time out in the Rocky Mountains on a survey crew. This is John Singer Sargent's portrait, a very handsome portrait of Olmsted at that point when he was near the very end of his career among the native azaleas that he planted by the thousands there. Well, by 1895, as the fair and Biltmore were concluding or over, two of the brightest young partners had all suddenly died, and quite prematurely. Fred Sr. himself was entering dementia, only to go off to McLean's sanitarium near Boston. And the firm was in a turmoil. Well, the two brothers managed to reorganize it, and they kept on. One of the first projects they had was to return to the Chicago Fair site and to work on what has become Jackson Park. This planting plan that you see here in John Charles' hand shows the key elements of the park: a set of linked ponds or lagoons and planted islands connected to Lake Michigan via canals and inlets, a large open lawn, continuous boundary planting of trees and shrubs, with a series of smaller spaces, curving paths, and carriage drives, and a formal ensemble of architecture overlooking the park from the north. In this case, it's a residual building from the fair that has been repurposed for a science museum. Well, this formerly very marshy site was quite flat. Others that John Charles and his brother Rick designed later have more vertical interest in topography. But nevertheless, this scheme could almost be seen as a recipe and of the principal ingredients for dozens of parks that they were to create in the next decades. Well, just as their father had served clients on the West Coast, so too did the sons, developing a national practice. This is the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition of 1905 in Portland, Oregon, planned and laid out by John Charles Olmsted. Next, he planned and designed and laid out, worked with a flock of local architects, the grounds of the Alaska-Yukon Exposition in Seattle, which was located on the grounds of a fledgling University of Washington in the outskirts of the city in 1909. It was, again, John Charles Olmsted did almost all the work on this particular project. Returning to after the fair, he was asked to reorganize the university, and he made it one of the handsomest in the country, reorienting it to this view of Mount Rainier that you see here. This is Volunteer Park on Capitol Hill in Seattle, and it contains a very familiar sylvan design aesthetic employed by the Olmsted brothers ubiquitously across the country. In this case, it's been done with careful attention to a palette rich in indigenous conifers and broadleaf native trees, as in their work in numerous other parks in the Pacific Northwest. Here's two postcard views of Lake Washington Boulevard in Seattle that J.C. laid out in 1908 to explore the topography of the city and the region when private automobiles were rapidly replacing horses in our cities and in our countryside. Well, if he was busy working on all those, one of the things to say about his younger brother is that Rick was a consummate and creative bureaucrat who, like his father, successfully could navigate the halls of government. In 1902, he joined Daniel Burnham and Augustus St. Gaudens and a few others as the principal author of the Senate Park Commission's report, which is commonly referred to as the Macmillan Commission, and which was instrumental in developing what has been called, as you see here, the Kite Plan. When these are renderings they presented of the federal core in Washington, D.C. Less well known, however, is the fact that the Senate Park Commission plan was more ambitious. It laid out a complete comprehensive plan for the entire federal district, not just the monumental core, but also for the river corridors, for Rock Creek, and for the entire region within Washington, D.C. A few years later, it began as it was going into implementation. Rick was instrumental in inventing and staffing the National Capital Planning Commission to implement the plan. This photograph on the left shows that august body in its early form in 1928. And Rick is the second one from the left there, looking rather stiff at you with his head cocked. Anyway, this is him a few years later, of course, and he's matured into a more comfortable soul. But what you see is that on the left, oh, I made a mistake. Let me just back up here. Okay. The two brothers, I'm losing my notes. The two brothers were going along, and then JC died in 1920. He was quite older than his younger brother, but both of them, when they were still working together, were very instrumental in a series of things. One was in helping to found the first university degree program in landscape architecture in the world at Harvard in 1900. And then a year later, in 1901, they helped found the American Society of Landscape Architects in 1909. Then in 1916, Rick wrote what is commonly called the Organic Act, which is the bulk of the law that created the National Park Service. And here he is working later on the plan for Acadia National Park in Maine. Well, it's not surprising then that Philadelphia would turn to the Olmsted brothers firm for assistance at the beginning of the 20th century. On the left is a detailed portion of the 1687 Thomas Holm map of Philadelphia and its vicinity, which, if you look carefully, will show you can see the broad marshes, the sloughs, creeks, and tidal wetlands at the conjunction of the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers. Even after 200 years of filling and draining the area, the land was still deemed difficult and undesirable for commerce and development at the beginning of the 20th century, leading the city to designate a very large portion of it for parkland. In 1899, Samuel Parsons Olmsted's successor at Central Park and head of the New York City Parks was asked to make a design, but scandal involving contracts for filling the land here stopped the work. Then in 1904, the Olmsted brothers were asked to submit a scheme. Their design for what was the southern terminus of Broad Street, was to be a pair of green squares, originally named Oregon Park. It was renamed Marconi Plaza in 1937. It was to serve as a gateway to what was known as League Island Park via a multi-lane boulevard consisting of an alley with 6 rows of trees, rather like the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, which was being implemented at the same period. The park design consisted of familiar pastoral elements. You look carefully and you can see very familiar pieces. There were perimeter shelter belts of trees around the outside with forest plantings. There are large areas of greensward, open meadows. There's a series of interconnected ponds and lagoons with islands. There's curving paths and carriage drives with a familiar low arch bridges and a minimum of architecture. The water bodies were laid out along the former course of Hollander Creek, and they were but sufficient reshaping and modest mounding was done to ensure drainage. Broad Street is shown to continue through the park to the south to give access to the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Well, by 1917, as work resumed, the area east of Broad Street Extension had been redesigned to form a large sports ground, and the western lakes had been reshaped with a set of lawns varying in size, their orientation, and their character. It has all the earmarks of a quintessential Olmsted Park in its elements, in its circulation, and in its circulation. Its resemblance, albeit less extensive in scale, to underlying ideas and gestures in J.C.'s earlier design for Jackson Park in Chicago, I think can easily be attributed to the similarities in the existing wetland conditions of the abandoned sites that they were working on. Construction had begun earlier, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and it was progressing very slowly. Here on the left, you can see the initial shape and edge of the largest lake and how little they had to work with. Well, after moving vast quantities of earth, planting thousands of trees, building drives, bridges, and paths, it became a park. Photos taken in different periods show the evolution of it from League Island Park into something moving from what it originally was, a bleak, immature, pastoral nature, to one eventually, we skipped something, excuse me, or is it? Okay, well, yeah, it's out of order. Okay, never mind. I will just say, let me back up. This shows you that the transition, and this is during the Depression. One of the things that happened was that in 1926, the city of Philadelphia decided to have a sesquicentennial celebration of America's independence. Well, 50 years earlier, the youthful Fairmount Park had been the site of the Centennial celebration, and a number of buildings were built in League Island Park here at this time in 1926 for American and foreign national exhibition pavilions. The eastern portion of the park, which you saw as an open sports ground with a big meadow, it disappeared under a municipal stadium and is never to return. For a number of reasons, the fair was a complete flop. Not as many people as were predicted and needed came, and the city was left with an enormous deficit. Well, photos taken in different periods show this evolution from that rather bleak, immature, pastoral nature that we saw to eventually it became this more wooded, quite bucolic park that contained several buildings that remained from the fair, particularly a boathouse that had been the Russian tea room from the Exposition. Well, with the onset of the Great Depression, 3 years later, the park became a vital place for recreation and community spirit. This was a fulfillment of one of Frederick Law Olmsted's more important goals, and that of providing ample and healthy outdoor space for citizens of all ages and class to mix, especially those like recent immigrants, minorities, and those with low income or few opportunities in their lives. Economic, social, and political change, of course, inevitably leads to changes in cultural products such as literature, art, and parks. And so in the 1940s, a public golf course was created that took up most of the western half of the park. It's been said that it was done partly to take care of the recreation for the workers in the Navy Yard, but I think it was also a fashionable, very intriguing sport for a lot of people. They were following Sam Snead and Ben Hogan, people like that. Well, after the death of our president, who had led the nation through the Great Depression and through World War II, the name of the park was changed. Oh my God, something has appeared. We'll just keep going. The name of it was changed to Franklin Delano Park. Again, as time passed, society and the fortunes of the city changed with the loss of manufacturing in the shipyard. Fairmount Park's priorities and resources shifted in response to demographic shifts in America and to new immigration. Demand upon its resources and changes in environmental laws and recreational needs eventually led to the closure of the golf course just 2 years ago and plans for its repurposing into habitat with recreational and educational trails. The importance of this enormous resource in South Philadelphia, while obvious to some, was not acknowledged within the city leadership and budgetary processes for numerous decades, which led to the creation not too long ago of the Friends of FDR Park, and the Fairmount Park Conservancy began setting in motion a planning and lobbying campaign to repair, to restore, and enhance the park. Working with the Franklin Institute and a number of professional firms, principally WRT, a comprehensive master plan has been developed and approved. Funds were established and approved to begin the rebuilding and recreation and transformation of this park, only to have everything stop dead for now by COVID-19 pandemic and the enormous financial problem that has fallen upon the city. If ever there were a project that qualified for infrastructure aid, such as is proposed by the White House and current members of Congress, this is surely it. The bones of the Olmsted Park plan, if you go there, if you know it, they're really easy to see. Here is the Broad Street Boulevard leading ceremoniously from the northern square, now Marconi Plaza, south into the park. And one of this on the right is one of the circumambulatory drives that were laid out, a la the usual park vistas and places to perambulate. Vestiges of the 1926 Exposition also remain, as in this handsome American-Swedish museum modeled after a 17th century Swedish villa that's located on the north perimeter of the park. Although it was closed through the COVID pandemic, it reopened again this week. And this is the North Meadow Lake with its relic boathouse, gazebo, and vegetation as they looked yesterday morning. A truly spectacular scene. Picturesque, you must say. And here are Edgewood Lake below it and the gazebo again yesterday. Their setting considerably changed by time and the processes of nature and the cycles of urban economics, maintenance, the use and abuse over the past century, both care, great care and love, and also neglect. In this past year, when our civil society has been in such turmoil and suffering, and the places that millions of Americans have turned for solace, for health and community, have overwhelmingly been our nation's parks. The pastoral vision developed by Frederick Law Olmsted and his sons has never seemed more compelling. Remarkably resilient, their work continues to possess great value for those who live in the city, whether recent immigrants or long-established residents. Regardless of ethnicity, gender, or age, this park, like many others, provides equal access to fundamental aspects of nature, generous open space, to water, to light, to sunlight and shade, fresh air, vegetation, birds, fish, flowers, trees, places to relax and exercise and to come together for many diverse events and special events for peace and quiet. FDR Park is really a microcosm of the Olmsted vision. And as such, it is one of the treasures of Philadelphia. That's it. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie. That was fascinating. And I feel like I certainly learned a lot and took a ton of notes that are going to come in very handy in the next couple of weeks. I think we do have some questions.
I'm sure.
But I just, to think about FDR Park and having this new kind of iteration and being so needed and needing to go back to the principles that it was designed upon, really, and how relevant that still is today, even 100 plus years later. Do you have any insights into why Fred, I'm going to call him Fred now since he did, but why he didn't do more work in Philadelphia? I'm thinking that he would have been so active at the time that Fairmount Park was coming together. It was also a time that the city was a pretty wealthy city relative to later.
What I'd say, Nicole, is that I know he came down at one point when the Fairmount Park people were thinking of creating Fairmount Park. And I think he looked around and said, well, you have very good people here and you're already doing the right things. He said, you just don't do too much. And he sort of waved his hands and did a few things and had some conversations. But I think he felt that there were people here who should be doing it because they knew how to do it. And I think he was also very busy at the time. But I don't think he was dissing Philadelphia. I think he just felt that we had it in control. They'd already set aside this vast preserve. They had Wissahickon Creek. They had both of the plateaus on each side of the Schuylkill. And so I think he felt that people knew what they were doing, and that the transformation after the Centennial, when they removed most of the buildings, only left a few, that what more? Don't do more. He thought he didn't think they should overdevelop things. So I think that's part of it. I also think there are other, in terms of the estates and private gardens, there were other people who were very talented at the time, working, out on the main line and up in Chestnut Hill and various places. Although his sons did do a fair amount of work here later. I mean, they did a lot. Yeah, the Olmsted brothers did a lot of work on college campuses and private estates. Yeah.
And then the other thing, so
I can't hear you.
Yeah. The other thing that I'm hearing is sort of like with Fairmount Park, that almost was an Olmsted landscape inherently, and it didn't need him to come in.
Yeah, because see, he really liked raw nature and undeveloped nature. He thought he loved wilderness and wanted to preserve it. So the fact that it wasn't already agriculture, that it had to be reclaimed, or it wasn't urban, it wasn't a ruin. Most of his sites were pieces of bottomland, and they were steep hills, and they were places that were difficult to develop, and they were the leftover, skipped over areas are on the edge of town. And so here was a place where there was this seemingly forest already that just needed a few drives and roads in, and a few paths and trails. I think he loved the idea that it wasn't overly civil, but it could absorb a lot of people.
Yeah. And so with the pastoral kind of landscapes that he designed, I mean, I think of an Olmsted landscape as almost looking natural. It almost doesn't look like it's been as manipulated as it really has been. But of course, there's a whole mastermind behind it. But were there ever projects that he just turned down, that there just wasn't enough there to work with, or could he really transform the sort of least attractive, that had like the worst sort of set of advantages into something?
I don't want to speculate on that because I don't know the answer, but I do know that the projects I know that he turned down was because of the politics or the people. He didn't trust them, or he thought it wouldn't work, or they were not going to be funded, or the people were, to his degree, he felt too shady or politically compromised. So he had a high aesthetic, but he also had this very high ethical standards. And he battled Tammany Hall and New York politicians. He quit as director of Central Park twice. He resigned several times. He would walk out if things got really out of hand. So I think it was more about humans, not about sites. I think he was undaunted by physical challenge.
But it's just the people.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Here's a question that I'm going to actually read because it's a little bit of a long question. So I'm not going to.
I hope I can handle them.
So this is from Matt. In funding debates, pastoral landscapes can sometimes be viewed as voids when compared to more active sites like ball fields and playgrounds and rec centers, and therefore they don't compete very well for operating and maintenance resources that they need. How would you make the case for investing money required to provide the rich horticultural and maintenance needed to make pastoral landscapes thrive as public goods?
Well, Olmsted himself was disturbed by the creation of too many facilities and of sport courts in his parks, because he felt that the passive nature of the park, that they were already full. He didn't think that Sheep Meadow was empty. He thought it already had content, and that it could be used by more people than a group of tennis courts there. He felt that their ambiguity of use, their ambivalence, was part of their strength, that they weren't over-programmed, and that they didn't need the same maintenance that sports grounds did. He thought the sports grounds tended to be clubby. They tended to be possessed by groups, then other people were forced out, whereas there was an open, in terms of equity and access for all people. He felt that the forests and pastures allowed more people in for more benefit than physical sports. He believed in health and recreation and activity, climbing hills, going on hikes, doing that sort of thing. And he didn't really despise sports. He just didn't think they should usurp the other qualities. And so how to argue for it with some of the bean counters? Well, it turns out that the people who have organized sports turn out to be very active lobbying of politicians. They're expert because they're organized. Whereas all the various people who live in households who aren't part of a team and want to go use a meadow, they're not organized and they don't lobby and they don't squeak a lot. But the need is greater probably for all the people who aren't playing in Little League baseball or aren't on soccer teams. So finding a balance is important. And I think that in this case, one must say that it's a scandal that we have not funded parks adequately, given the role they play or can play for the health and well-being of the community.
And we saw that so much in this last
Pardon?
year. Even though we saw that so much in this last year, and even though the deferred maintenance of a park might not be as obvious to the naked eye, especially,
but they were suddenly almost trampled to death because everybody, if you went down to the river, if you went to Fairmount Park, if you went to your neighborhood park, they were jammed with people, and we were nervous whether we'd all get sick going into the park. There's so many people there, because people immediately went out and they went to find solace in the nature and with each other. And I think that's the biggest defense for the chap who just asked about that, because everybody didn't all rush out to go play tennis. Or, they just wanted to go be in the park with their kids and with their mother and with their family and whatever, see friends that they didn't dare see indoors, right? Or walk their dogs, go fishing.
Yeah, right. A couple more questions, and this one kind of is a good segue. So you talked about the powerful feelings and opinions that Olmsted had about the democratization of space, but how did he square that with some of these private commissions that he did for these incredibly wealthy individuals, like, for example, the Vanderbilts? Was it John Vanderbilt? What was that experience like for him to work with some of these people?
I don't know any. I think a lot of designers, what happens is that we all have to pay the bills, and actually some of those projects for the fat cats actually help subsidize some of the work you don't get adequately paid for when you're doing private work. And so I would say that currying the favor of people like that allowed him and with other designers in later times and more recent, currying favor with the powerful by giving them handsome environments quite often gives you access to and helps you lobby for public works that they can fund and they can lead and they can make happen. They want to be loved like everybody else, most of them. But there has been this problem ever since the popes, we say, or the Caesars, that designers work for people, all sorts of people, good and bad, quite often, and so and whether we think they're immoral or not for working for the rich, the truth is that Vanderbilt at Biltmore, there are some 80,000 acres of forests that were put into forest preserve there as part of it, and it's one of the great forests of the mountains there. And Gifford Pinchot, who was put in charge of that piece of the private estate, ended up being the first head of the United States Forest Service. And so out of these projects comes other things quite often for social good. If you leverage it, if you handle it properly. I mean, clearly there are wealthy people who are corrupt, and there are wealthy people who are truly noble, just as there are poor people who are not nice and poor people who are wonderful, and so the problem is that the estates, yes, they're private, and that's why Olmsted wanted to do the big public parks. He wanted to do something for the people who couldn't pay the bills. All the little people who couldn't imagine a park like he imagined, and they couldn't dream it up, and they couldn't pay for it. They couldn't make Tammany Hall build it, but he could, and some of his wealthy friends could.
So being a deft tactician was a part of his success
yeah.
overall for getting these big
that's
projects
right. He leveraged their goodwill toward public works. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I never would have known this. Well, I want to just thank you again so much for being willing to share your very, very deep wealth of knowledge on this topic with us. And I feel like it will give me personally a completely different perspective of FDR Park, where I plan on spending many hundreds of hours over the next few weeks. So
needs a lot of work, but I think a lot of people will come to the flower show, and who have not been there, I'm sure. And I think it's a wonderful idea, because that's another one of the things he believed in, and that was having these special events that bring people to public places that come and go. And one of the things is, it'd be wonderful if the flower show doesn't go back inside some big thing like an airplane hangar again, and we're to stay like the Chelsea flower show outdoors. I know it's a different time of year and it's a little peculiar, but you could figure it out. You already have.
Sounds great to me.
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to seeing you at the flower show. Yeah, everyone else, there's also, for people who are still on, there are some great resources about Olmsted to learn more, including olmsted200.org, which is all about the sesquicentennial of his birth in 2022. Is that correct?
Right. That's right.
Yep.
Yeah, so, April 26th, I think it is, 2022 is 200 years. All right. All right, thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.
Bye.